All right, ladies and gentlemen, I am Ryan. This is Chapter 15, Managing Human Resources Globally, presented by Team 5 or Team Morocco. It's your choice. All right, so I'm going to start off with going over the goals of the presentation. The first goal is going to be explain the staffing, training, and development needs with a focus on expatriates or expats. We'll learn what those are later. Goal number 2, understand labor relations in both the home and host countries. Next up, discuss how the institution-based and resource-based views shed additional light on HRM, which stands for Human Resource Management. Goal 4 is participate in 3 leading debates concerning HRM and draw implications for action. Lots of exciting stuff. All right, we got Putin here thinking really hard. Now, this brings us to staffing decisions. The fundamental question with staffing is, how does a multinational enterprise decide on who to hire? The hiring process, that's called staffing. So let's go over some terminology before we jump into it. First up, host country nationals, or HCN. These are citizens of the host country or the locals. I'm going to be running with the example of Samsung. So this would be if Samsung were to come to Texas and put a plant down, we would be the host country nationals working at Samsung. All right, next up we have expatriates or expats. These are non-native employees who work in a foreign country. You can call these the outsiders, of which there are 2 types. We have parent country nationals or PCNs. These come from the parent country. So Samsung is a Korean enterprise. That means these would be Korean workers working here in Texas at the Samsung plant. And not to be confused with third country nationals. Third country nationals or TCN. This is if Samsung were to hire, say, a German manager to manage the plant. So they would come from a different country than both the host and the parent country. All right, moving along. Okay, so these are some advantages and disadvantages. I'm just going to name a few. So you might ask, why would you hire a PCN, TCN, HCN? What does it matter? Who cares, right? Well, the parent country nationals, obviously they're going to have a lot more qualified people because they already understand the business, they understand the culture. So Koreans working in Samsung are probably going to be the most effective. However, they're probably going to be the most expensive to bring over here and work. So that's a downside. And next up is the third country nationals. So this would be like the German manager. They may be less expensive than the PCNs. So that could be an advantage. However, I found this one funny. Host government and employees may resent the TCNs. So there may be some animosity in there because of a different culture clashes going on. And then finally, the host country nationals, these would be us Texans working at Samsung. So the benefit is the language and culture barriers are eliminated. And the reason is because we kind of bridge that gap between their culture and our culture. So we are the translators, we can solve the problems, and we're good to go. Downside is we may have limited career opportunity unless we're willing to just pick up and move to Korea to advance our careers or something like that. All right, so this brings us to the case study of Samsung. So this is an actual example. And I really like this example that the book gave because I was actually in Korea for 2 years with the military. So I can definitely relate to this one. So let's start off. So the background is in the 1990s, Samsung was struggling to recruit and retain foreign managers. So the average employment of these foreign managers were less than 3 years, which is pretty severe. Nobody wanted to stick around Samsung. So they set up an internal consulting team called the Global Strategy Group. All right, their goals were to develop a pool of global managers enhance Samsung business performance, and globalize Samsung. So all pretty straightforward. So here in 1997 is when they actually gave birth to the Samsung Global Strategy Group. Fast forward to 2003, only 1/3 of original global strategists were retained. Now this again was due to challenges with cultural integration. So they really hadn't improved much, even though they had this new global strategy group. So they had to change their ways. They had to figure out what was wrong with their systems. And so what they ended up doing was by 2011, the retention dramatically improved with, now they had 2/3 retention. So of the 208 that they hired, 135 actually stuck around, which is really a good improvement for any company. Now, 2013 is when the study ended. Now, at that point, they had over 400 projects completed. They came from 18 different countries with 19 different languages, 6 years of average work experience, and an average age of 30 years. I thought this was interesting because these are some pretty big positions that they had, and yet there were some pretty young guys they were throwing in there. So I found that interesting. All right, so you might be asking, how did they improve their systems? Well, there's a few key points that I wanted to bring out. And so the first one is Korean colleagues have had to change their work styles and mindsets to accommodate westernized practices. So I think, and I can relate to this one. So in Korea, the older population generally sticks to themselves. They generally only speak Korean, and they're very hesitant to take on any sort of westernized values. They drive Korean cars, they work at Korean businesses, everything's Korean, right? They don't really like outsiders. The younger population is a lot more accepting of this and these different cultures. And so you're starting to see a shift, but I think this is more of that shift happening, is the colleagues, they kind of had to adjust to the westernized values. Next up was the non-Korean MBAs. It's kind of on the flip side. They had done such things as eat kimchi and drink Korean wine at dinner parties to fit into Korean culture. Koreans love to drink and eat kimchi, so that makes a lot of sense. I experienced some of that myself. And then third is, once global strategists graduate through the proper 2-year training, and I'm assuming this was in Korea, many are able to work in Samsung subsidiaries within their home country. So this is like, if you were to go and work for Korea, you'd have to move, or go to work for Samsung, you'd have to move to Korea, get the training for 2 years, fully assimilate and understand their culture, and then move back to Texas. I think that's really rewarding for people because it's kind of that light at the end of the tunnel, especially if they don't like Korea very much, but they still want to work for the company. They're able to with this option. So lastly, teams also had a project coordinator who was a senior Korean manager acting as a liaison between the team and the management of the internal client company. Now, this is super important. 2 of the facilities that I worked at in Korea on base, we had this person. They were management and they were Korean, but they spoke very good English. And even if, this is so important because obviously there's a language barrier there. And so even if you had a English speaker that knew some broken Korean, and then you had Koreans that knew some broken English, there'd still be a lot of gaps and a lot of miscommunication. So it's super, super important to have somebody like this, a liaison, to step in and actually solve those problems. And in both cases, both of my managers are very effective at doing so. So I think this is a great tactic. And with that, this is the end of my part. I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Alex, and thank you guys for watching.
Alrighty, thank you, Ryan, for that introduction to expatriates. And so now I'm going to be covering basically what exactly is expatriation. So this essentially is just a process of selecting, managing, and motivating expatriates to work abroad. For example, it's to no surprise there are definitely companies that are sending workers to other countries of interest and where they have a strong foothold. So what they try to do is they try to incentivize these workers that are in the U.S. to send them over there. And primarily when they do this, they have four roles in mind. And so typically they're sent as strategists. So they're over there abroad representing the headquarters interests or the MNE's interests. Next, they'd be daily managers. So not having someone from the original country over there can sometimes hurt a company abroad. But now, since they're sitting an expatriate over there, they're able to run operations and build local capabilities similar to that of how it would be back at home. They are on top of strategists and daily managers, ambassadors as well. So they're over there as representatives essentially, and they're building relationships with the host countries, and more importantly, the host country stakeholders, because they're of the most interest to them. They're also trainers because typically most expatriates, if they don't end up in failure, which I'll touch on in a little bit, they don't always stay there for forever or really for a long time. So they serve as trainers in a sense as well. So they're preparing the next person that's going to fill their spot in the future. They're making sure that they can do a good job once they leave. Okay. And so next, like I mentioned before, there is expatriate failure. And I mean, it's not to no surprise that expatriate failure rates are pretty high, considering, I mean, you're really just throwing someone into a completely different country. And it's not really the homesickness that I would say gets to these people. It's a lot of other factors, such as adjusting to a country's culture, adjusting to their norms, or trying to bend their norms to the company's norms, which there often tends to be a lot of friction. And there are three primary causes of these failures. And so you would see a lot of premature return or earlier than expected return. So this can mean that the expatriate just simply just wants to go back home. I mean, they just don't want to be there anymore. They don't fulfill their tenure there. They don't, finish up their contract abroad. They just say, I'm kind of finished. Or sometimes it's not even them themselves. It's just there's just too much friction in the work environment abroad. There's also unmet business objectives, and this is pretty hard to maintain, considering that you're pretty far from home and you're higher ups, and so you're kind of essentially in a spot where you have to make sure, or the expats are held more accountable to make sure that these goals are met. But most of the time, these goals actually aren't ever met or up to higher management satisfactions. And then there's also unfulfilled career development objectives. Sometimes it's just more like a self-fulfillment requirement. Sometimes a person just feels like it just wasn't the right choice to move abroad. Yeah. And so next I'll be handing it off to Andrew, and that'll be it for me.
Hi, everyone. This is Andrew Dossman, representing Team 5, and I'll be covering the training and development needs for expats and local country nationals. So training is a specific preparation for a particular job. Development refers to more in-depth, broader preparation of managerial skills from the two groups. First, you have your expats, your expatriates. These are foreign nationals working in a foreign country for a multinational enterprise. And then you have HCNs, which are locals working for a multinational enterprise. You could see that Samsung was ahead of the curve in the earlier case study in 1997, where they took a bunch of Westerners and integrated them into their managerial processes overseas, and they had a lot of success with it. So many of multinational enterprises unfortunately don't do very much training for their expats. They just kind of wish them luck when they get there. But that's a really bad way to do it. What you want to do is pretty much the rule of thumb is training should be reflective of the length of stay that somebody's going to be there doing a job. So if they're only there for 6 months, maybe train them like how to say to somebody else, where's the bathroom? How do I get to the train station? Things like that. They're going to be there for a longer period of time. You want them to have knowledge on different societal cues and tolerances, things like that, because every country is going to be different on that. So something you might do in America might be offensive to them in, say, Korea. So you want to try to prepare people for that. But out of a 2019 study, it showed that 91% of expats felt that they received very good compensation for their jobs, as opposed to 73% of the locals thinking that they got good pay for their jobs. It also was about the same percentage when asked about if they were committed to the organizational goals of the company, like the company's vision. Locals didn't have as high of a need to see the organizations through as expats did. And expats were twice as likely to want to recommend working for that company again. So yeah, there's the slides. Okay, and surprisingly, if you're between 18 and 34 and you're an expat, there's a 35% salary raise for going and working overseas, which I found really surprising and makes it kind of enticing to go. You get to live in a different country and you get a 35% raise. It's not too bad. Some big companies in Europe that have expats, SAP is a software company, Mars Candy, and Philips Electronics. But they're out of Amsterdam, I believe. And the top 10 countries that employ expats, the first top one is the UK, but that's probably changing a lot now post-Brexit period of time, followed by Japan, and then China, India, France, Hong Kong, South Korea, Australia, Argentina, and Turkey, I believe. So with that, I will move on to the next. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. Now I'd like to talk to class about development for returning expatriates. So this is also called repatriation, which is it's a tongue twister, but it's also the process of facilitating the return of expatriates. So some potential problems that this process has is that it has the breaking of psychological contracts, which is something like saying a boss tells you to take this opportunity overseas because it can develop your career. You might think when you return, this boss might think of you highly and possibly even promote you, but this just isn't the case most of the times. The boss can just change their mind, or they might not even be the boss anymore. Another problem is that they can feel like a small fish in a big pond, because when they were an expatriate overseas, they felt important. Everyone knew them, and they're just different from everyone. This made them feel important, and now when they're back in their home country, they feel the same, and they don't feel so important anymore. Another problem is adapting to their home country. A person that's been overseas for a long time can just struggle to go back in society and their normal workplace. You can also include if they brought their family overseas. Say if you brought your kids overseas, it can be really tough for the kids because they just have a fresh start. And a problem is about a third to a fourth of the expatriates exit the firm within 1 year. Potential solutions to these problems could be the company having a career development plan, which is a person helping the expatriate obtaining a higher up job or just a more challenging job in the company, because this makes them feel more important and keeps them busy. And despite some of these problems, most of the times, there's not any problems with returning to their home country because it's just like riding a bike. Now, training of HCNs or host country nationals, why you should train HCNs is because the more training and the more opportunities are provided, the more talent you retain. Such opportunities like career development plans. This just involves them or helps them climb the ladder in their company. This drastically affects turnover rates. It's 40% to 7%. That's dramatic. And
hello, class. So today I'll be talking to you guys about the compensation and performance appraisals process in expatriate compensation. So with the compensation rate in the overseas and everything, companies want to make it pleasing and attractive to employees. So they have the going rate, which is basically the rate that whatever industry you're in, say you want to be in accounting, so you'll be getting paid whatever the compensation rate is for accounting in whatever host country you're in. And versus we have the balance sheet approach for compensation. That is the going rate for when you go to underdeveloped countries, and then companies make it more attractive and they pay you more incentives and everything to go because the pay will be less than what you'll be making if you're in your home country. So I have a little chart here. We'll go over the two different types, the advantages and disadvantages of each one. So the going rate is the advantages of it are basically equality among parent and host country nationals. It's the simplicity of it and the identification with the host country. The disadvantages is the assignment might vary from what it is in your home country going to a host country. The re-entry problems, people get used to doing it one way and then they have to readjust when they come back stateside. And then for the balance sheet approach, and this is actually the most commonly used approach because typically most employee companies start companies in lower developed countries. So this is the best way to get those employees and give them a compensation package to go overseas. So, and that's equality between assignments is both the same, and then the cost and complex administrator. The disadvantages is more costly to the company. And also it is a great disparity between the countries, which is why they have all of those incentives to kind of keep you there, even though you were in a lower quality of life. And so here on my next slide, this is more so on the balance sheet, just kind of give you a comparison of how they incentivize to go to a host country. So as you see, they have a base salary of around 150, and then you get 37,000 for cost of living, another 30,000 for overseas premium, then you get 30,000 for a hardship allowance. So they make it pretty pleasing to be over there, and only this minor deduction is 10,000 for housing for the housing deduction. But as you can see, you went up $80,000 basically to go overseas versus just staying in the home country. So, and then just a quick analogy about this is just so take our country, Morocco. So if you want to go, if you're in accounting, so basic accounting in America is around $30 an hour, but starting accounting in Morocco will get paid around $45 to $55 an hour. So in that scenario, you'll be going to a built-up country for accounting, and you'll be getting actually almost $25, $30 more an hour just to go to Morocco, a beautiful country. And so that will do it for me, and I will be passing it off to Jarek. I hope you guys enjoyed my presentation. Have a great day.
Thanks for James. And now let's move on to the compensation for HCNs. And the HCNs has two levels. The first level is the low-level labor, and the second level is the high-level executives. And the distinction between these two levels can be shown by these little cute animal pictures. And for the low-level laborers, they have a bigger population, but they have low or non-bargaining power. And this is really a cost-saving strategy for the multinational enterprises, because the labors in those emerging economies generally much cheaper than in their home country. And for the high-level executives, they have a smaller population, but they have a higher bargaining power. See, talented people always have the exceptions. And then this leads to the question, is it really a cost saving to hire HCNs as a high-level executives? You can think about that. If you pay them not as much as the expatriates, they might turn their face to your competitors. But if you pay them as much as the expatriates do, then where's the cost saving come from? And here's the composition which James talked about for the expatriates and I just talked about for the HCNs. And those are all the initial benefits you receive when you first enter a company. But you will never stay in one position in a company. So it requires further appraisal to determine your future. So those performance appraisal would generally have four purposes. The first one is decision making, is to see if to decide if you could get a higher pay or you get a higher position. Second one is development, it's decide whether maybe you need additional trainings for your current position or for your future position. And then the third one is for documentation. And this might not be useful right now, but it could be used in the future for further performance appraisal to see if you improved or not. And then the last one is subordinate expression. It's more like if there's something you want to express to a supervisor. But here we're not going to go in depth of those purposes. And now we're going to move on those in this little graph. Let's suppose that this triangle represents the subordinary of multinational enterprises. And the management team generally will have these three levels. The first is HCNs. The second is expatriates. And then the top one would be the offsite supervisors, would be located in the home country, not in the subordinate, so which is outside the triangle. And the performance appraisal between them there's two parts. The first part is how the expatriates evaluate the HCNs. And there is this black line here to define the cultural differences. So for example, if the HCNs are from a high power distance country, they are less likely to express their thought or ideas during a performance appraisal. But what if the expatriates are from a low power distance countries, they are more likely to encourage the HCNs to express their ideas, and this conflict could cause the HCNs to view the expatriates as indecisive, and which could cause the obstacles involved the HCNs. And then let's move on to the second part, is how the offsite supervisors evaluate the expatriates. Because the offsite supervisors does not know what is going on inside the triangle, they have no actual experience in the subsidiary, so they would heavily rely on the on evaluating the expatriates by those hard numbers, those financial information like the market growth, the productivities, and which those could be cause unfair evaluation if there are some uncontrollable forces like the currency crisis. So a fix for that is there's two ways to fix this situation. The first way would be increase the communication between the offsite supervisor and the onsite expatriates, so that the offsite supervisor can pay more attention on the non-financial information, and so that they have a fair evaluation on those onsite expatriates. The second way would be rely on the former expatriates who are now offsite supervisors to evaluate the current onsite expatriates. And in this way, the offsite supervisor knows exactly what is going on in this little triangle, so that they can give a more fair evaluation to the expatriates. And now let me handle this to Julian for your next topics, which is labor relationship.
Hey guys, Julian here, and I'm going to talk to you today about managing labor relations in both home and host countries. Now, basically what labor relations is a firm's relation with a union. A firm's key concern is to fight off those lower cost competitors from emerging economies. A union basically is interested in helping workers earn higher wages, obtain more benefits through something called collective bargaining. In the US, it's statistically seen that unionized employees earn more than 30% higher wages than ununionized employees. So you can expect there to be a little conflict between these unions and the managers. A union will use disruption as bargaining chip. Basically, they will utilize the ability to throw strikes or slow down work or refuse to work overtime, just something to bungle up the firm's flow of business. Now, a firm's bargaining chip is the ability to just threaten to move business overseas, give those jobs to workers overseas. However, from this statistic we can see here, in 1983, 20% of employees were unionized, whereas in the present day, it is all the way down to 11%. So a lot of jobs are being found overseas instead of putting up with these unions. And there's a similar trend in developed countries such as Britain, France, Japan, Germany. These unions are organized on like a country by country basis. So there is no national labor union that can follow a firm. Next, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about managing labor relations abroad. So the Japanese and German automakers, when first coming to the United States, they wanted to avoid these heavily concentrated union areas, what the book refers to as a union stronghold, because if it were up to the multinational enterprises, they want to pay their employees as little as they can so they can turn out more of a profit. So what the Japanese and German automakers did was set up plants in small southern rural towns in Alabama, Kentucky, South Carolina. I think that would be pretty interesting, having these foreign companies with a completely different demographic of workers available to them. Now, developing countries definitely welcome multinational enterprises because they enhance gross domestic product. They actually even try to participate in silencing unions. And we can see that in 2010, changes were made. There were strikes against these foreign companies, Foxconn and Honda. Now, Foxconn is a Taiwanese company and Honda is a Japanese company. These high profile strikes, they took place in China. But the Chinese government kind of just looked the other way. However, they kind of kept at it and ended up forcing these multinational enterprises to increase pay by 30 to 40%. So, like they say, the days of cheap labor in China are gone. And that concludes managing labor relations.
Thank you, Julian, for that quick introduction. It is Kelsey. I'm reporting for you live from Port Aransas. Today I'm going to be talking about institution and resource-based views of human resource management. So let's get started. But for institution and human resource management, it's a constant battle between formal and informal rules, formal rules being rules, laws, and regulations, and then informal rules being like norms and values, kind of the norms in the workplace. A good example of this is with Japan. Companies within Japan, it's kind of a norm to like discriminate against women. You don't see a lot of women like higher up in leadership positions. But when they transfer that business to, like, say, the United States, there's rules and laws that they are challenged with discrimination laws. And so they kind of have to break those norms and values to get business done. So that's a good way to talk about institutions. Moving on into resources, we kind of go towards the VRIO model. We're going to talk about each of those individually. Cute little cat meme over here if you got a chance to read it real quick. But we'll get started with value. So starting with value, does this HR activity add value? So there's two ways to kind of look at this. The first way is talking about your generic like payroll and benefits aspect. Those, it's kind of essential, but it doesn't really add value. It doesn't make the company any different or better versus if you look at something like training. And training employees, almost every job has to have a training process. That's going to create assets with other companies for their employees, and that adds value. So you got to think about that with each activity that the HR department is doing. And then going into rarity, is the HR system rare? That's kind of a difficult one just because every company is going to have a HR system, whether it be just payroll or distributing benefits or just the trainer who trains you on the job. It just depends. So it's not very rare. Everybody's going to have that. So it doesn't really set anybody apart. But going into inability, how easy is the HR system to imitate? That kind of goes into a different company can look at another and be like, wow, like I love how they run their system from the inside out. Like that's awesome. If you want to imitate it, it's easy to imitate a certain practice, but then it gets difficult trying to imitate their whole system. So it's a very complex system of HR, and trying to imitate every single part is really difficult. For example, I like to talk about the coronavirus right now, kind of a hot topic. Within the coronavirus, Outback Steakhouse, their CEO actually gave up their whole year's salary to give to the frontline workers and their employees. Now, although that's really cool, other restaurants are like, wow, like they got a lot of press from that. That's awesome. But are those CEOs going to be willing to give up that year's salary? Probably not. It's a cool idea, but it's hard to imitate. And then finally, organizational. It's going to be how the HR system is organized, from teamwork, diversity to training, all that good stuff. In the book, it kind of dives deep into teamwork and diversity. Diversity is a really hot topic. You, in any organization, you're going to want to have people from all different types of backgrounds and history and way they kind of view situations and perspectives. Although that's great, if you have too much diversity, no one's ever going to get along and see eye to eye on a lot of things. So it's good to keep that in mind. It's a very nice, easy balance to try to hold on to. But yeah, you have to keep in mind the VRIO model when talking about your HR system. And now on to Mark.
Okay, so this part of the chapter talks about best fit versus best practice. And Best Fit School argues that firms need to search for their best internal and external fit, individually tailored to that firm, specifically like best fit their needs. And so the external way is shaped by national and industry context, kind of what's going on in the industry or field of line that the firm is based off of, and kind of what's working in their HR department, what's proven to work, what's not working, and kind of the national context in that, kind of what's going on in their nation, as well as internationally, if there's anything to disrupt their line of field. And internally, it is driven by the strategies that they choose to implement in their firm. And that kind of dictates how they're going to run their company as far as their HR department and their other lines of work. And one critic for the best fit is that the quest for the best fit is often continuous in that times are always changing, and what works for a company now is not guaranteed to work for a company 10 years later down the road, because times are always changing, things always improve, and stuff along those lines. And so best practice school argues that firms should adopt the best practices regardless of the context. So essentially just saying that there's a universal set of practices and guidelines that a firm should implement in their company, regardless of what's going on internally and externally. And some of the best practices, examples that the book gave, were extensive training, basically just saying, making sure your new employees are trained to the extent that you want them to perform at, and that there's no gray area, and they're trained at a high level if you want them to perform at a high level. The next one being high pay for high performance, basically just rewarding workers by paying them a high amount of wage if they are performing to a high extent. And the other one being emphasis on self-managed teams, basically just implementing teamwork within your organization or firm, and making sure that they go about solving their problems or anything they have to solve as a team first, and they have that basic guidelines. And one critic about the best practice approach is that if all firms choose to select a certain set of practices to implement in their firm, and they kind of lose their value, in that it's not as universal, it's not as black and white. Like what works for one company is not guaranteed to work for another company. But on the other side, there are a basic set of practices that are proven to work for the majority amount of firms, and that are proven to pay off in the long run. So the next one being expatriation versus impatriation. And I know we touched on expatriation previously in this chapter, but I'll just kind of reiterate the definition to make sure it's kind of fresh in your head. So it's non-native employees who work in a foreign country, whereas impatriation or impatriots are citizens of a foreign country working in the home country of a multinational enterprise. And the purposes of implementing repatriation in a company are one being filling skill shortages at the home headquarters that are not found, I guess not found in the home country, but where you go elsewhere to kind of recruit the talent to bring into your home country for whatever reason that being. Second one being develop a global mindset for these repatriates so they kind of develop this global business mindset both in the professional world and just to experience kind of another culture through work. And some examples of repatriation are IT workers from India coming to work in the US at IBM. Another one that the book stated was telecom workers from China coming to work in France at Alcatel-Lucent. And so some of the struggles that come along with implementing repatriation are that some of these repatriates are not paid equally in contrast to their host country coworkers. The book gave an example about Indian IT professionals and how they paid 10 to 20% of the amount of an American worker doing the same line of work. And so obviously they are upset at this matter that they're not getting paid equally for doing the same work. And a lot of the times they, because repatriates are only set for a period amount of time, they're usually not permanent. And so when they do return back to their home country, they oftentimes choose to not elect to work for an M&E like this company that they worked for previously, and elect to work for a rival M&E who offer the equal amount of pay for the work that they are doing. And that kind of wraps up my share of this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mark. I'll end chapter 15 by talking about management savvy and what it means or takes for a manager to be successful in the human resources department. Human resources affects up to 10 to 20% of a firm's market value, which is a pretty big number. The fourth thing that human resources managers need to be is they need to be curious, competent, courageous, and caring. When I say curious, I mean they need to know the formal and informal rules and how to govern other people. By being competent, they should know the firm's strategy and goals and implement this into their decision making. Courageous means they don't always agree with the CEO or top line managers. In a quote by the retired GE HR head said, "If you just get closer to the CEO, then you're dead," which means that take into account the lower level employees too when you make your decisions. And the final thing is to be caring. And that just is pretty obvious, is HR managers should care about other employees. And we'll finish this chapter off with a Kahoot. Thank you.